The rules for assigning and dealing combat damage in Magic the Gathering have gone through several major revisions over the years. As of the release of this video, the most recent change occurred about a month ago with the release of Magic Foundations. This was the first major change to the combat damage rules since 2009 with the release of M10. I've been thinking about making a video about the history of combat damage, and particularly damage on the stack, for a while, and now seems like as good a time as any to do it. As a quick note, throughout this video I'll use the term attacking player to mean the player whose creature is dividing combat damage between multiple other creatures. This is because a single creature being blocked by multiple creatures is much more common than a single creature blocking multiple creatures. And in the situation where a creature does block multiple creatures, the rules for dividing damage between multiple attackers are and always have been the same as the rules for dividing damage between multiple blockers. It's easier to just say attacking player rather than the player whose creature is blocking or blocked by multiple creatures. So with that out of the way, let's get into the history of the major rules changes to combat damage. Alpha. Whatever, you'll figure it out. The very first Magic set, Alpha, was published in August 1993. In Alpha, the rules for combat damage, like other rules, were pretty loosely defined. The game was created by Richard Garfield, with help from a few friends, and they expected that Magic would be played as a fairly casual game among friends, so there was no need for the rules to cover every possible scenario in great detail. They figured that if the rules were unclear about how a particular interaction worked, the players could decide within the group how they wanted to handle it. The rules for unblocked attackers and creatures blocked by a single blocker were essentially the same as they are now. The main rule relevant to the history of combat damage is that, quote, a blocked attacking creature may distribute its power in damage to the blockers in whatever arrangement the attacker chooses. There were no specific rules for when damage prevention effects could be used, or whether players could respond to combat damage at all. The original version of the game also had a weird rule where blockers that become tapped would not deal any damage to the creatures they were blocking, although they would still take damage as normal. I'm not entirely sure why it was decided that the rules should work like this, but it made effects that could tap creatures at instant speed, even stronger than they are under the current rules. This rule would be removed in the 6th edition rules update. Revised, the damage prevention step. Once Magic started to take off and was being played at actual tournaments, Wizards quickly realized the need for more formally defined rules. There were a number of changes in the early years of Magic to various aspects of the rules to clear up ambiguous rulings and cover situations that the original team had not foreseen. The first updated version of the rulebook was released with Revised in April 1994. This updated rulebook cleared up the steps of combat and when players could and could not play spells or abilities. Under these rules, there was a special step for combat damage assignment. As in Alpha, the attacking player could divide damage as they want between multiple blockers. After damage was assigned, the damage prevention step occurred. This was a special step that occurred any time damage would be dealt, whether during combat or as part of the effect of a spell or ability. During this step, players could only use spells or abilities that either prevent or redirect damage, or regenerate a creature. Players could not use these effects at any other time, and players could not respond to combat damage with any other spell or ability. Damage prevention effects were much more common back in the day, hence the need for a special step for them. These effects have become much rarer in newer sets, so while the rules still need to be able to handle them, they're not considered important enough to warrant their own special step. 6th edition, damage on the stack. The first major change to the rules occurred with the release of 6th edition in April 1999. This saw a radical overhaul of the rules, with pretty much the entire rulebook being rewritten. Among other changes, this was the set that introduced the stack to Magic. Before that, spells operated under the batch system, which was like a more complicated version of the stack. One of the biggest changes was to how combat damage worked. The damage prevention step was removed entirely. This meant that there was no longer a special step for playing damage prevention effects, and you could now play these effects at any point during the turn, and the effect would remain until the end of turn, or until it actually prevented damage. Instead, to give players a chance to use damage prevention in response to combat damage was now put on the stack, like a spell or ability would be. Players would know how the damage was going to be dealt, and could then respond to this with any spells or abilities they wanted. Once no player wanted to respond with any spells or abilities, the damage would resolve like a spell. Damage on the stack would still be dealt if the creature that assigned damage was no longer on the battlefield, just as activated or triggered abilities of creatures will still resolve if the creature leaves the battlefield. This had a few implications, but the most important was that any cards with activated abilities requiring creatures to be sacrificed as a cost were much stronger, since you could wait until a creature had been assigned lethal damage before sacrificing it, allowing you to get value out of a creature that was going to die anyway, and it would still do combat damage, which would often lead to getting a 2-for-1. Mog Fanatic is probably the classic example of a card that was made much stronger by damage on the stack. This was an amazing card back in the day. When damage went on the stack, it could assign 1 damage to a creature that it was blocking or blocked by, then use its ability for 1 more damage to any target. This meant it could trade up against creatures with 2 toughness, which would often be a big tempo gain. Or it could get a 2-for-1 by killing a 1 toughness creature in combat and another 1 toughness creature with its ability. At the time, it was easily one of the best 1-drops in the game and earned the nickname Mog Fantastic. While Mog Fanatic was probably the most iconic card to benefit from damage on the stack, it was far from the only one. As I said, any card with an ability that required sacrificing a creature was just so much stronger back then than they are now. I remember when I first started playing, the most dominant deck in Standard was Ravager Affinity. It was already a really strong deck due to its ability to dump pretty much your entire hand within the first few turns, but damage on the stack made Arcbound Ravager even better than it would otherwise be, since you could wait for your artifact creatures to assign damage to your opponent's creatures, then sack them to your Ravager to get a bunch of +1/+1 counters from creatures that were going to die anyway. Another kind of card that benefited from damage on the stack were instant speed effects that would bounce or flicker creatures, as you could wait for damage to go on the stack, and then bounce or flicker your creatures to save your creatures while still killing the opponent's creatures. This is not an exhaustive list, and many other abilities benefited from damage on the stack. Experienced players generally liked this rule because it allowed them to get extra value from creatures, but it was very unintuitive for newer players. Let me tell you, the first time a newer player encountered damage on the stack, they almost always felt like they had been cheated. And one thing I want to clarify, because this is a mistake that some people who didn't play at the time make, even when damage was on the stack, it was all still dealt simultaneously. Sometimes people assume that damage on the stack meant that each creature's damage would be a separate object on the stack, and damage would resolve 1 creature at a time, but that's not how it worked. Combat damage was a single object on the stack, and when it resolved, all creatures dealt damage at the same time. This was relevant, among other things, for when a creature dies effect. If a creature with such an effect was killed in combat, it would always see all other creatures that died during the same combat step, and would trigger for each of them. M10. Ordering Blockers. The next major change to combat damage was with the release of the 2010 core set, commonly known as Magic 2010, or just M10 for short, in July of 2009. M10 changed a number of different aspects of the rules, and was the largest rules change since 6th edition, although it was nowhere near as major as that update had been. The M10 rules removed damage on the stack. To allow players to have some idea of how damage would be split up between multiple creatures, this update introduced the ordering of blockers. If an attacking creature is blocked by multiple creatures, the attacker chooses the order of the blocking creatures. Then both players have a chance to play spells and abilities, such as damage prevention effects or pump effects, and then the damage is assigned and dealt with no chance to do anything between assigning damage and dealing it. Players can no longer split up damage as they choose. The blocker that's ordered first must be assigned at least lethal damage before any damage may be assigned to the second creature. The second creature must be assigned at least lethal damage before any damage can be assigned to the third creature, and so on. This worked well enough for the most part, but it has a few problems. First of all, lethal damage only considers how much damage is assigned, not what will actually be dealt. Say for example, you have a Jaya Venerated Fire Mage out, and you attack with a red 4/4 that is blocked by two 3/3s. What you'd probably like to do is assign 2 damage to each of them, which Jaya's ability will then increase to 3 damage to each of them, killing both. What you have to do instead is assign 3 damage to the first one and 1 to the second. When the damage increasing effect is applied, the first creature will take 4 damage and die, but the second will only take 2 and survive. Similar situations can occur if you have a sweeper like Pyroclasm in your hand. You may want to split damage between multiple blockers so that the sweeper can finish off all of them, but instead you're forced to deal lethal damage to the first blocker, which may result in not doing enough to the second blocker to be able to kill it with the sweeper. This update also nerfed creatures with what we used to call the Basilisk ability, or when this deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature. If it's blocked by multiple creatures, you still have to assign lethal damage to each of them in order. You cannot just do 1 damage to each of the blocking creatures and let the ability kill those creatures, which is something that you could previously do. These and other things were considered when the change was made, and ultimately it was decided that these things were worth sacrificing to get rid of damage on the stack, which was such an unintuitive rule, and removing it led to a lot more interesting decisions in combat. When damage on the stack was removed, many players complained that it was dumbing down the game, or removing strategy. But really it was the opposite. Without damage on the stack, you always have to ask yourself, do I want my creature to deal combat damage, or do I want to get the ability for sacrificing it? With damage on the stack, the answer is both. You want both. There may be a few super niche situations where you want one or the other, but 99.9% of the time, you want both. Without damage on the stack, it's an actual choice much more frequently. Foundations. Assign damage and deal it immediately. Foundations has changed the rules for damage assignment again. Damage may once again be divided between multiple blockers in any way the attacking player chooses. Damage is then dealt immediately, with no opportunity for either player to play spells or abilities between assigning and dealing damage. This brings the rules back to more or less how they worked in the early days, but without the damage prevention step. Prevention effects must be played before combat damage is assigned, so the attacker will know about them before dividing damage. This change makes combat tricks slightly worse on defense. Previously, for example, if you blocked a 3/3, with 2 of your 2/2s, you could let your opponent order the blockers and then pump the toughness of the first blocker to above 3, which would save both creatures. Now, in the same situation, there is no ordering. If you want to pump one of the creatures before damage, your opponent can still kill whichever creature you don't pump. As I say, this does make combat tricks slightly worse, but let's be real, how often are combat tricks on multiple blockers actually relevant? Multi-blocking and relying on a pump spell to save your creatures was always a risky move with a high chance of getting blown out, and was generally only done when you have no other choice. The rules overall still favour blockers, since you can choose your blocks to maximise your creature's chances of survival, and the option to multi-block at all allows multiple small creatures to gang up on a big creature, which is something that's not possible on attacks. This change also makes damage prevention effects slightly weaker when multi-blocking, as the attacker can assign damage to whichever creature is not targeted with the prevention effect. But let's be real, damage prevention effects were always garbage anyway. One thing I noticed is the number of people saying that this makes Death Touch too strong, because you can split the damage between the blockers. But you could already do that. While ordering blockers nerfed the Basilisk ability, there was a special exception made for creatures that have Death Touch, making it so that one damage is enough to be considered lethal, and you can spread the remaining damage to other blocking creatures. The fact that so many people didn't realize that this is how it already worked shows how unintuitive the rule was. This change does strengthen creatures with the Basilisk ability, but really it just puts them back to how they worked when they were originally printed. So that's a brief history of the rules for combat damage. Personally, I think the Foundation's rules change is a good one, as it's far more intuitive than the old rules, and combat overall still favours the defending player over the attacking player. Who knows when the next major change to combat damage will occur and what it'll be. Personally, I always kind of thought they should have kept damage on the stack, but just made it so that creatures that leave the battlefield before damage resolves don't do any damage. That would be a little weird in that it would work differently from how abilities work, but I don't think it would be a major issue, and I think it's still fairly intuitive. Let me know in the comments what you think about the Foundation rules change, or just tell me that I'm an idiot for liking it. Anytime anything changes in Magic, you can guarantee that a small but vocal subsection of the community will complain about how this is ruining the game, and the game will be dead soon. While Wizards have made some decisions recently that do make me a bit concerned about the long-term health of the game, a relatively minor change to how combat damage works that won't even come up in the majority of games is not going to be the thing that kills Magic. Many people had the same reaction when damage on the stack was removed from the game, and it's still going strong 15 years later.